Hey guys, another video. This is going to be a topic that I've been thinking about this for a while now. I don't know. It's with like this last generation. We're in the new generation now, but I don't know. I just thought of this, and that the topic of this video is going to be gameplay versus story, and what you end up preferring. I know I've always looked at video games as having like a certain ratio. Or like in terms like for me, what's my ratio for story and gameplay? Like what do I look for when I play a video game? Do I look for half and half, 50% story, 50% gameplay, maybe something else? And more, I feel like my opinion has kind of changed on things, and obviously everyone's going to be different in this regard, which is why I want to hear people's opinions on this. Um, I always used to think that I was a half-half kind of person. Like, as if the story in a game is great, but the gameplay is subpar or crappy, I can get through the game. I'll still end up liking it. Deadly Premonition is a perfect example of a game like that, where the story and characters are amazing. Granted, it has this open world aspect that I think is really unique for a horror game, but the gameplay in that game, yeah, it's not the greatest. But it's the story is so good in that game that you want to see it through to the end, and the gameplay doesn't really it doesn't bother you in the end. I used to think I was like a 50-50 person where, the opposite could be the case, where the gameplay in a game is flat out amazing, but the story is absolute garbage. But more and more these days, I'm starting to think I kind of prefer gameplay more. And that's, I think, the two big games that have made me kind of realize this. I hate bringing these games up, but they're just so fresh in my memory, and they came out last year. The Last of Us and BioShock Infinite, both very story-driven games. You're going to play these games for the story and characters, and that's what these games succeed at. But I find myself not really enjoying the gameplay in these games that much, and I find a lot of games are kind of going for this, that are going in this direction, at least for AAA game development, especially in like the Western front, although Japanese developers are starting to do this too. But where you have a story-driven game, where it's, the focus is on story and characters, and there's cut scenes, but at the same time you've got this gameplay kind of interspersed with the story stuff, and the gameplay just, for me, never really kind of elevates up to the story. It doesn't match up with the story, and it's kind of one of those things where I kind of honestly feel like with those games, Last of Us and BioShock Infinite, I enjoy those games the most when I'm not actually playing them, and I think that's kind of where I stand, where I kind of feel like gameplay is more important to me at this point. Granted, story is still big for me. I'd say my ratio right now, I think, is probably a 70% gameplay, 30% story. A good example is a game like, I think, Dark Souls, honestly, although the story is actually pretty good in that game, although I find like the lore and characters more interesting than the actual storyline itself. But that game, it's not presented to you in cutscenes, and it's not, it's not force feeding you all this, all this story, all these story and characters, right? You got to kind of find that stuff for yourself. And it's a very gameplay driven game, and I find myself having much more fun with games that don't really, games like that don't, don't. They're focused on the gameplay, but the story doesn't get in your way. Whereas, honestly, for me, like BioShock Infinite and Last of Us, this gameplay kind of got in the way for me, and is what ultimately made me not enjoy those games as much. Of course, this is just me. A lot of people really love Last of Us and BioShock from a gameplay standpoint. I kind of find with story-driven games, I kind of more prefer something like Gone Home, which is a very story-driven game, but at the same time, the gameplay kind of works with the story. It works in tandem with the story, where in Last of Us and BioShock Infinite, the gameplay to me feels like separate from the story in a lot of ways, with like giant shootouts that last forever and waves upon waves of enemies, where in Gone Home, you're exploring this house and kind of piecing together the story for yourself. That is the gameplay in the game, is exploring this house. And it kind of weaves in with that storyline that by the time you get to the end of the game, because of the work you've put in exploring this house, the ending is it's excellent. It's really great. Another game I want to bring up is 999 and Virtue's Last Reward. Especially Virtue's Last Reward. Again, both very story-driven games. A lot of text. I mean, they are visual novels. Gameplay-wise, you've got the puzzles, the puzzle rooms, which, again, that is a part of the story. You know, and that's, I think, why I like those games so much. And then Virtue's Last Reward, I don't want to get into spoiler territories, but some of the mechanics in that game, some of the gameplay concepts, tie in with the storyline in mind-blowing ways. And that's why I think why I love those games so much, because they can only work as a video game. To me, like games like BioShock Infinite and Last of Us kind of feel like movies to me. Like they could be done in a movie format. Where something like VLR, Virtual Last Reward, just cannot be done in any other way. The Walking Dead is another good example of a story game where, it's got very basic gameplay, but it's not. It doesn't wear out its welcome. It doesn't bog down the game in any way. And then you have all the choices you make in that game, which affect events later in the game, and then just the story and characters in that game being amazing as they are. So yeah, then you have games like Tomb Raider, for instance, which are like, in my opinion, it was kind of like lacks kind of, well, the gameplay in that game is pretty solid. I prefer it over the Uncharted, but with that game, I thought the story and writing and like Laura was pretty good in that game. I liked her character, what they did with her character, but like the side characters and the actual storyline itself in that game, oh man, like just dreadful. But at the same time, it went for that kind of approach. You could tell like they wanted that story to be important. I mean, there's a lot of cutscenes in that game. There's a lot of dialogue, but at the same time, you can kind of get past that. You can kind of just throw the story away. Child of Light just recently is another good example where it's like you could tell they really tried with the story, but because of that whole like rhyming thing they do, it falls flat, and I had to kind of get through on the gameplay alone, which is why I think I enjoyed that game more than some people, because story is actually, the whole point of this video, to get to this point, why I said the ratio, like 70-30, I'm finding myself caring more about gameplay in games these days. I find like games that are, have amazing stories but not that great gameplay, I have less patience with than games that really focus on their gameplay, but the story might not be that great. It was weird because before I was definitely more of a 50-50. And different genres are different here, because like with JRPGs, RPGs, that is an area that's a type of game where I do prefer the story. Like if the story is not great in an RPG, it's going to be hard for me to want to play more unless the gameplay is just absolutely amazing. And then of course you have some RPGs that do both of those really well. Persona 4 comes to mind. I mean, I love the story and characters in that game, yet the gameplay is really deep as well and is really excellent and challenging too. So I don't know. I'm sure there's more I could say, but what are your thoughts on story versus gameplay? What's your ratio? Do you prefer story in games or gameplay, or do you prefer like an even 50-50 split? We'd really like to hear your guys' thoughts on this, but anyways, that will do it. I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.